Hello, good local time wherever you are, and welcome to another installment of the DigitalBC live stream hosted by the Exchange Lab. For those joining for the first time, these calls are hosted monthly, covering a wide range of topics relevant to the digital government community in British Columbia and beyond. They're typically hosted by the incomparable Jillian Carruthers. However, Jill's away for a spell, so it's my pleasure this month to try and follow her lead. For those I haven't met, my name is Rumon Carter. In a former life, I co-founded the Exchange Lab, so this is a bit of a very welcome homecoming for me. But for the past year and a half, I've been leading service transformation efforts in our Provincial Parks and Protected Areas Agency, BC Parks. As an employee of BC Parks, it is my pleasure to work in and for every region of what we now call British Columbia. Today, though, I'm joining you from my home on southern Vancouver Island, very near the site of Sitchinall, a former village of the Songhees people. I acknowledge that these lands are the traditional territory of the Lekwungen-speaking people, that I am an uninvited settler here, and that it is my welcome responsibility to honor the relationships between people and land that have been in place here since time immemorial. As I acknowledge my place, I also acknowledge my positionality and my physical appearance for those unable to see me. I'm a Caucasian cisgendered male with very short brown hair, brown eyes, and a salt and pepper beard. I'm wearing a white shirt to contrast with this fancy digital BC background, and my chosen pronouns are he and him. Before we dive into substance, a quick handful of housekeeping items to share. This session, like all in the series, is being recorded and will be shared publicly via YouTube. As you'll have already figured out, we're on MS Team Lives, so please ask questions in the chat, in the Q&A, upvote those you'd like to hear answered, and we'll be addressing the most popular ones during our conversation. Questions we don't get to today, we'll address in our follow-up podcast with today's guest, which will be recorded and shared later in the month. If helpful, you can turn on live captions in this app. Look for the three dots at the top of your screen and click the button to toggle them on. And at the end of the session, you'll receive a survey. The Exchange team would be grateful for you to fill it out, as they do, I promise you, read every submission. I know this for a fact, and use them to drive topics and adjust approach to these sessions. Okay, let's get into it. Kicking off last month, the Exchange Lab is sharing a series of DigitalBC live streams focused on the key levers of digital era government. The first of those levers, governance, was discussed in a conversation last month with Namita Sharma of the Ontario Digital Service, where that team supports a particularly rigorous expression of governance grounded in their simpler, faster, better services legislation. I recommend you search the Exchange Lab's YouTube channel and give that episode a watch. Beyond governance, both the literature and my own work experience indicate that other key levers of digital era government include internal capacity building through hiring, upskilling, retention, and succession planning, the provision of guidance and learning, outcomes monitoring and analysis, procurement, and funding and investment. It's the last of these, the approach our government is taking to improving funding for digital, that we're discussing today with our guest, JP Fournier, Executive Director of the province's Digital Investment Office. Welcome, JP.
Thanks, Rumon.
JP, in promoting today's live stream on social channels, I described you as one of the most adept and effective government operators I know. I think you've also heard me refer to you as a bit of a Swiss Army knife when it comes to navigating government. You've earned that reputation with me over the past years since we first met, when I was working to pivot a failing large-scale transformation project, here come the air quotes, and you were an analyst hand-bombing data into CSV files to support that so-called transformation. Can you tell us a little more about your fast path from data jockey to fixer of government funding?
Yes, absolutely, Rumon. Back then when we met, I think it was really interesting. We were, a lot of us were surrounded by some of the brightest people we'd ever met, working harder than we'd ever worked before, and yet it wasn't working. We weren't really delivering value to British Columbians the way we wanted to. I think my observation from those times were that project was more of a product of the system within which it was created, rather than a product of the people running it. And I think one of the things that makes me say that is back then, at that time, I remember David Eves at the time, who was teaching digital government at Harvard, came to town to do a training session with us. And I remember for the first time having my mind blown, learning about DevOps and agile delivery, and where and cloud services, and where large organizations and governments around the world needed to go. And I couldn't help but looking around me and realize the system we were operating within, and the way we were working was a fundamental mismatch with the way modern digital teams work. And so that day in that room at the old Exchange Lab with David Eves, I decided then that I wanted to fix those problems. And I've been on that mission ever since. And I've worked in product management, digital procurement, digital policy and strategy, and most recently have taken on the role of executive director of digital investment.
So why is it that you're particularly keen on digital funding as the change lever that you wanted to lean into?
Great question. So I'm a firm believer that a lot of our behavior inside big organizations, especially big bureaucracies, are driven by three big things. It's sort of how government communicates. The first is legislation and policy. The second is funding and resource allocation. And the third is smart people building wide networks to get things done. My thinking on why focusing on digital funding was pretty simple. If I wanted to focus on fixing some of the big issues I had experienced back at that big project, I thought I had to work those three levers. I knew really smart people working on legislation and policy and networks, but no one seemed to have figured out funding. And so that's where I chose to really lean in. And I've spent the better part of 5 years studying up really heavily on that issue.
You referenced networks as a change lever. I hope that, we probably won't have time today, but that's another live stream could speak to that as a change lever. But, in respect to that study you've done, how does digital funding traditionally work here in British Columbia?
Yeah, great question. And actually, BC has a really interesting and unique foundation that was set up about 10 years ago. Back then, Treasury Board, who's responsible, they're the cabinet committee who doles out funding and helps make resource allocation decisions, decided that they wanted to delegate responsibility for government's investments in digital products and services to a deputy ministers committee. That committee is now the Deputy Ministers Committee on Digital and Data, and they're unique in that I think they're the only Canadian jurisdiction that has a Deputy Minister Committee that essentially holds funding for all new digital products and services. So they hold government's capital envelope for technology. And I think that'll come back later, but that's a really unique and important sort of piece of background. Despite that, though, like virtually every big organization, historically, we've funded technology like we fund bridges. We made big upfront capital investments informed by big business cases that resulted in large, complicated projects. In terms of oversight and reporting, rather than looking at getting working software in the hands of users, traditionally we were very focused on financial oversight and red, amber, green charts against scope, schedule, and budget that may have been set 5 years earlier. Once projects were done, products were often chucked over the fence to under-resourced operations teams who did everything they could to keep those pieces of software alive, sometimes up to 15, 20 or more years when we decided enough was enough and we did another of these big projects all over again.
JP, you mentioned some of the good, but the subject of this talk is fixing the model. So let's dive into some of the things that are maybe broken or could be improved. What in particular would you point to as challenges with the current model?
I think for me, it's three things. The first is historic funding models encourage plan-driven approaches. They encourage large projects, and they make it really hard for us to maintain and update our systems. On the first, it's really hard with software to predict in detail what's going to happen when a piece of software hits the hands of users 3 to 5 years down the road. And yet our funding models emphasize locking in 3 to 5 year plans and then holding teams to account to deliver against those plans. And so rather than trying to predict everything in great detail, it's a lot easier to use prototyping, design research and iterative approaches to discover user needs and then respond to those needs rather than trying to predict them all. In terms of the issues with large projects, there's some global research by the Standish Group that has shown that 93% of large government technology projects don't meet their intended benefits. And fact is, it's a lot easier to deliver a small targeted improvement to a product or service than it is to deliver a poorly defined mega project. I think the third issue, and possibly the biggest of all, is that funding digital products and services as one-off projects is a fundamental mismatch with technology. Technology ages like fish, I like to say, and it doesn't take long until it starts to smell bad. It works a lot better when we have funding models that support the continuous improvement and maintenance of digital products and services.
All right. So how do we make this more like wine then? How do we fix the model, JP?
Yeah, when I started down this path, I was convinced that maybe accounting was broken, the discipline of accounting, or maybe that it was just because treasury departments didn't get digital. But the more I dove into learning about those topics, the more the facts led me to completely change my mind. I think right now, I believe there's a really straightforward principle that should guide our work on fixing digital funding, and that is that digital funding should match the rhythms of digital delivery teams. I've even learned to translate this into accounting speak. To them, I say, software is an asset class that depreciates fast and has high maintenance requirements, and so you need to fund it appropriately. Really what that translates to, though, in plain speak, is that digital products and services need basic core funding for teams to look after them and for sustainability, and then they need small, frequent bursts of extra funding to deliver on bigger priorities. And that when you do those things right, looks a little bit more like Lego blocks, where you can regularly swap out pieces and rebuild them in digital products and services.
Okay, so you've clearly done your research and your time in the trenches. That sounds easy, or at least, not too hard as you describe it. But how do we turn that into reality?
Yeah, great question. I mentioned earlier that there's a really important piece of the puzzle that BC has, which is that Deputy Minister's Committee on Digital and Data that we've established a decade ago that directs all of the government's investments in new digital products and services. The thing I want to highlight about this is, so my branch supports this Deputy Minister's Committee in figuring out how they want to allocate funding for digital products. And so we have this awesome opportunity to shape that. Where we started was the team that we have, building a high-performing team that were digital practitioners and who knew what they were talking about to assess digital funding requests and inform the recommendations of that committee. I think that was a really important foundation that we've laid starting about 18 months ago, and we really ramped up on that this past winter. So we now have a team of designers, developers, data people who know what they're looking at and therefore are very well positioned to provide advice. Second thing we did is really look at what kind of incentives were we driving with our processes, templates, all of that, and how could we tweak those to make it easy for ministries to do things, to fund products and services the way digital teams work and flow. So the question we asked ourselves is, what if it was really hard for ministries to get funding for giant projects when they didn't have sustainment funding or a permanent team or weren't using great approaches? And similarly, what if it was really easy for teams to get small, frequent bursts of funding to help them to deliver on a big epic or two? And so we've started overhauling all of our processes, templates, and evaluation criteria to make sure we're aligning the way we fund technology with the rhythms of digital delivery. I think the third thing we're doing is spending a lot of time talking with both digital teams and finance teams and teaching them how to communicate with one another. Digital teams need to learn finance and accounting. Accounting teams need to learn about digital, and those who lead our organizations need to know all of this stuff in great detail. And so we've been spending a lot of time doing that. I think the last thing we're going to do is, once we've field tested all of these things and landed on a set of processes and templates and all of that works, we're going to codify those in an updated policy document.
JP, I, for one, I'm sure many folks are glad you're on the job. And it sounds like you have a plan. And I want to quote a friend of ours, Honey DeCane, from the FedGov, who's observed that bureaucracy is a feature, not a bug. And what she means by that is that our internal system is designed for stability, not change. You're seeking to change a significant part of what is arguably government's most foundational element. That change is going to take time. So while you and team are underway, what can others do now? Are there any ways to, call it hack the digital funding system?
Yeah, that's a great question. So I think the first thing I would say is the best advice I can give to people leading digital teams, say product owners or even members of those teams, is become a Swiss Army knife. What that means to me is digging into the seemingly boring and bureaucratic. Learn how the budget cycle works. Learn how to read the estimates. Go read public accounts. Know your way around core policy. Go meet your CFO and get to know your finance team. Get to know your procurement teams. What all of that does is equips you with the language you need to better communicate what you're up to and what you need with your CFO and your leadership team and your executives. Weaponizing that knowledge, that network, along with some of those guardrails and incentives that we're well underway creating in the Digital Investment Office. If you're in BC, you've got a pretty good path to making sure that you can land sustained funding for your team, and that it's the first thing that your ministry allocates rather than the afterthought that it tends to be historically.
Okay, appreciate that. And appreciate everything that you shared so far. We're going to transition to some questions from the audience here. Thank you to those who are firing your questions into the Q&A and those that are upvoting. The one that has the most likes so far, JP, is from Steve, who's a long-standing digital era actor, colleague of ours. And he asks or observes first that despite more ministries moving to modernize their technologies and methodologies, it seems, as he observes, I think he's got this right, that silos persist and that digital projects are continuing in isolation across government. Along with funding transformation, do you see an opportunity for your office to help foster collaboration and broader strategic alignment? And maybe, beyond that question, do you have any recommendations for how others could lean into that same kind of collaboration and alignment?
Great question. That is definitely a role that I mentioned, that little team that we formed, that cross-disciplinary team of digital experts. One of the jobs that they play is they spend a lot of time with teams from across government, and they have this unique bird's eye view where they know at any given time what 85 digital initiatives are underway across government, what common component teams are up to, who's doing what in the Exchange Lab, what our colleagues at who deliver our shared IT services are up to, and what their roadmaps look like. And so what that allows them to do is provide really great advice and matchmake in many cases, and connect teams together to make sure we're not duplicating efforts and that we're joined up and that teams don't have to solve really hard problems independently and in silos, and rather can kind of build on each other's learning and knowledge.
Just going to riff on that like a bit more. Can you think of any particular incentives that would help to accelerate that kind of shift, whether inside your office or otherwise?
In terms of explicit incentives, we've got a recent change that we've made to the way we fund digital products and services. So every year, Treasury Board allocates a budget to the Deputy Ministers Committee on Digital and Data. And historically, we've sort of sat around waiting for ministry initiatives to come our way. One of the things we've done differently this year is very intentionally set clear investment objectives for what goals are we chasing with that funding. And so one of the goals we set up was one around encouraging teams. So we allocated a set amount of funding towards products and services that help reduce duplication across government or otherwise accelerate the work of digital teams. And so we've now got dedicated funding for anyone anywhere in government who's interested in investing in a product or service that does that. So that's one of our intentions, or one of the recent things we've been up to try to create some incentives for that.
It sounds like a really positive way in which your office is seeking to accelerate the metabolic rate, if you will, of government, because our priorities are shifting so fast, and technology is typically delivered on the order of multiple years. It seems super positive. You mentioned our model here where, through the Government Chief Information Officer, you have delegated responsibility for a capital envelope. We have a question coming in, often asked is, if and when we might expect a shift from a capital-focused model to one that is more oriented towards operating. The question asker, wonders, what sort of time frame to an 80-20 shift. For example, do you have a sense of, what the shift might look like, and if and when it might be possible, if it's a goal you're seeking?
Yeah, maybe I'll talk broadly about that. So if we look forward, there are a few things on the horizon that might drive a shift, a broad shift. Although I don't think it'll be as extreme a shift as people might expect from the outside. From CapEx to OpEx. And I think one of the big trends there is cloud services. And so as more and more of our systems shift towards models where our infrastructure, or even in some cases platforms, and in other cases services are consumed as a service using monthly or annual subscriptions, that drives up our operating costs. Similarly, if we've got digital teams doing continuous improvement, and more maintenance, what that means is they're probably a little less reliant on the giant mega project. However, I think there's a really important thing, which is, having spent now a lot of time with Canadian accountants, our public sector accounting standards in Canada are very clear that software is an asset, and assets with a life longer than a year tend to be capitalized. In BC, we typically the test is 3 years or 5 years, and I don't see a world where software development isn't really capitalized unless the accounting world in Canada decides to make a pretty fundamental shift. Where that leaves us is, what do blended funding models look like, where we have sustained sort of baseline of operating funding for teams to look after products and services, or in some cases portfolios of products and services, and then how do we supplement that with targeted bursts of capital? If you want to dig into that, I believe the Exchange Lab team has been posting in chat. There's a Bright Bites talk that I gave a few months back called "How to Make a Successful Digital Funding Request," where I dig into that a little bit more. But I'm firmly convinced that blended models, where we have a little bit of capital and a solid baseline of operating funding for teams, is the way forward. Maybe one last point on this topic. In order to sort of embed that and start creating the incentives for it, any team requesting funding for a new digital product and service in BC, so anybody coming forward to ask for capital, one of the criteria is that they need to demonstrate that they've got sustained funding for once the capital project is over, to sustain that product and continuously improve it over time. And so that's a really important lever we've pulled to start shifting that.
You touched on most of this, but one of our highly upvoted questions, and just to see if you have anything else, hones in on that full life cycle of products, from design all the way through operationalization, always a hard word, and continuous improvement. And the asker references cross-functional teams, stitched into that the whole time. Is there anything about those team-based approaches and moving from discovery design to continuous improvement that you wanted to add? Full burn teams don't seem to be the kind of thing that we need to persist, but any sense of maybe in particular what those out years look like?
Yeah, for sure. I'm happy to dive into this a little bit more. So one of the things, maybe before I dive into that, that I've learned in the last 2 or 3 years, is that for a lot of people who aren't in digital teams or aren't in this space, the unit of delivery of a digital product and service starts and ends with a project, this notion of a project. Instead, I think those of us who are in this space understand that a product life cycle is much longer than that and starts with upfront discovery and design research, and shifts into prototyping, and then gets rolled out, and then continuously improved over time. A project, in my mind, is a tiny slice of that. I think of a project as, say, a 9-month effort to bring 3 or 4 big epics across the finish line to deliver a targeted outcome to your user base. That's sort of my definition of a project. And so, yeah, I just wanted to touch on that. In terms of out year, I think we also have this bad habit of assuming that there needs to be a one-to-one relationship between a digital team and a digital product or service. And that's definitely the case for our big keystone services and systems. But there's a lot of areas in government where we can get creative about building sort of portfolios of related products and services sustained with a permanent team. And no, that should not look like chucking a finished product over the fence to your poor ops team with 3 people and hoping they can stitch it together for 15 to 20 years.
We're coming to time. Gonna sneak in one spicy question, which is, all right, so we shift the funding model. How do we reconcile our staffing models to map to that new approach?
That is a great question, and one that here in BC, we've got 2 decades of legacy here to untangle in the next few years, where we were required by policy to outsource digital delivery. For me, the secret to that lies again in what I just talked about, which is rethinking the unit of delivery away from the project and towards the product, reimagining the purpose of the project, and then making sure that we're building in permanent, sustainable teams. Maybe one other thing I'll touch on that we've started doing is for the Deputy Minister's Committee on Digital and Data, any new digital product or service, one of the requirements in our evaluation criteria is they need to demonstrate how they're building internal capacity and starting to break away from that. So we're hoping to incentivize some shifts there, but we've got a lot of 2 decades of untangling to do here.
Indeed. JP, we're at time. Lots more questions in the Q&A. Looking forward to getting into those in the podcast. It occurs to me that maybe our best first lever for change is shifting mindsets and modeling those shifts. You do a great job of that. Thank you for being on the job, part of the network, sharing your time and insights. Thank you to everybody who joined in, and looking forward to following up on the great questions in the Q&A and a follow-up podcast, and seeing you virtually or in person, maybe at the lab sometime soon. All the very best. Thank you to the lab for hosting.